Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live Beyond Vizcaya session with us. Today, we will be having a very special guest. My name is Odine Monestein, so I'll start off by introducing myself. I'll be your host for today, and we are streaming from the enclosed loggia. So we just want to talk a little bit about the space that we're streaming from. In here, you will see a beautiful stained glass, which overlooks our formal gardens. So we invite you to come out and enjoy the space and pretty much walk around our very beautiful property. All right, so back to our guest for today, back to our subject for today. Today we will be talking about Black experiences throughout historic Miami. And today we have with us Dr. Marvin Dunn. Mr. Dunn has been the author of a number of books. One of them we'll actually discuss today. It's titled Black Miami in the 20th Century. So you kind of see that there. And Dr. Dunn is also a retired professor from Florida International University, and he is also a former chairman in the psychology department. So I want to say welcome, Dr. Dunn. We are so happy to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your
Very
time.
happy to be here.
Yes. So I want to go ahead and just jump right into your book. I think it was very interesting that when you started with talking about a legendary pirate's tale. And this was pretty much, according to your book, the first Black presence on Biscayne Bay. Possibly in the 1600s. So could you tell us more about it?
Well, there were Black pirates who used the waters off of Biscayne Bay to raid ships, and the landmass along the southeast coast of Florida was very convenient for them. They could come in behind these little islands. We call them keys. Many of them are right off Biscayne Bay and the Upper Keys. Hide their ships and raid and conduct their business. Black Caesar was a pirate who survived a shipwreck off the coast of Florida. He alone managed to get ashore, gathered up other Blacks who had been marooned or escaped slaves, and put together a crew. And they first took small boats, but eventually got a ship, killed the crew, saved the captain, made him teach them how to sail the ship, and then killed him. And then Black Caesar, as he was called, began in around 1640, 1645, raiding along the southeast coast of Florida. Had a hideout in the Upper Keys. As a matter of fact, the place is still noted on the map. That's Caesar's Creek. He had kept many of his prisoners on that place. We also have reason to believe that pirates were on the very property that Vizcaya now occupies. Legend has it that there was a freshwater stream that poured right into the ocean where Vizcaya is today. But when the building was put up, it was blocked off. And that pirates would come to that location to get fresh water. And when white people moved to Coconut Grove in the 1880s, they found iron implements around that spot, that spring, that's now on Vizcaya's property. And those implements had been there for over 100 years. So we know that there are pirates along the coast of southeast Florida. We know that one of them was Black Caesar, and that they were very successful until they finally got caught by the British and were executed.
Yeah, actually, I've never even heard about the legend until I watched your documentary that's based off of the book. So it's very,
it's not a legend. It actually happened. That he was a person. Right. So it's not a legend. In fact, there were two Black Caesars. Another one comes along he was a Haitian, comes along another 100 years later, takes the same name as the Black Caesar, and does the same thing until he got caught. So, the thing about piracy and Blacks is that very few people know even that there were Black pirates. And yet about a third of the members of crews on pirate ships were Black men. Some of them were slaves, but many others were free men who took part in the looting of ships and got their share as well as the whites with no discrimination. So in a sense, piracy was the first equal employment opportunity for Blacks in the New World. And many Black men took advantage of it. Yet that part of our history is not particularly well known.
Wow. Yeah. I wonder why that is, but I guess we can kind of go into that
No,
maybe a little bit later.
We know why it is. We know why it is.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
We know why it is. In our history,
Right.
Black men who took up arms and fought and killed white men, throughout our history, those stories have been suppressed. Whether you're talking about Black men fighting in the Civil War, Black men fighting the United States Cavalry in Florida to keep them being removed from Florida, stories of Black people arming themselves and taking advantage of that situation, particularly killing white people, those stories are buried on purpose.
Right. I hear you.
So this is an intentional thing that we don't know about these people. There's no accident.
Right. So, and I correct myself. Like you said, it's not legendary. There's proof of it, and there's reason why it wasn't uncovered. So I correct myself on that.
All right.
Yes. And then later on, your book starts to talk about the Bahamian settlements, the fact that they were coming in for various reasons. And you kind of mentioned one of them. You mentioned some of them were escaping slavery. And then your book also talks about how there were actual, I guess, former slave owners, or there were actually white folks that were bringing them from ships. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit? From the Bahamas?
I'm not quite sure just what part you're focusing on. Are we talking about escaped slaves who came down the Florida coast?
Right. So I have here
to get to the Bahamas.
So I have here that there were runaway slaves from West Indian plantations that were arriving in the Florida Keys. Some were dropped off after British sailors liberated slave ships in 1807. So this is the part that I'm referring to. You said others also flushed harsh racial climate and economic decline in the Bahamas.
So that is correct, yes. Once England declared slavery to be illegal, I think around 1807, and they would find, the English warships would find slave ships at sea, they would take those ships and bring the slaves to the Bahamas primarily and leave them there. Some of them were also dropped off in South Florida, but basically these were, you're quite right, these were English warships who were catching slavers on the high seas and took most of the slaves to Andros Island, which is why today Andros Island is the most Africanized island in the Bahamas. So yes, you're quite right about that, Odin.
Okay, and if you could just kind of tell us about maybe the transition of the migrants from the Bahamas here, as far as maybe life or labor.
As they came into Florida?
Having come over from, another, yes.
From the Bahamas? Well, in the mid-1800s, the Bahamian economy collapsed. A lot of people were hungry. Farming was, much of the land had been farmed out. So Bahamians started coming to Florida to find work. They began coming to Key West at first, because Key West was really the only city in Florida for a long, long time. So Bahamians would come to Key West to offer their labor. Many of them worked on ships, became very proficient in seamanship. Some Bahamian men even became ship captains. But many of them worked in farming and would come in for the season, and then we'll go back to the Bahamas. But over time, more and more of the Bahamians stayed in the Florida Keys, settled along the Florida Keys, and eventually ended up in Coconut Grove. We just saw an image of some of the homes that were built by these early arriving Bahamians in Coconut Grove. Bahamians started coming into Coconut Grove. Well, they were actually the first ones that brought Coconut Grove in the 1880s when the hotel was built by a white man, a Bahamian white man named Charles Peacock. But we do know that Bahamians were coming in into the Florida Keys to work in pineapples. At one time, pineapples was a major crop from the Keys all the way up to almost Palm Beach County and beyond. So a lot of Bahamians came in to work in pineapples. And then many of them stayed and settled in Coconut Grove. That's a photograph of the entire Black community of Coconut Grove taken in front of the Peacock Inn, probably around 1890s, maybe early 1900. But that's the Peacock Inn behind them, and these folks were brought there by Charles Peacock to work in that inn. That was the first hotel between Fort Worth and Key West. Miami didn't even exist when this photograph was taken. The man seated is Reverend Sampson, the first black minister in South Florida, and of course these folks are all folks who work there at the inn. Charles Peacock began building homes along what's now Charles Avenue. At that time it was called Evangelist Street, because the churches were located along that street as well. So, and then some of these folks came in, of course, and built their own homes along what's now Charles Avenue, and that became the historic Black Avenue in Coconut Grove. It still is today, although many of the traditional homes, just as we saw a moment ago, have been done away with, razed.
Right, and as you just said, oftentimes when individuals leave their home or they come from another area, another country, they do bring some of their traditions and, you know, their culture, and you kind of see that evidence in the way that they built their homes, you know, just the style, the colors. Yes. And then I know, go ahead.
I was just going to say, white people did not know how to use limestone to build homes. The Bahamians taught them that. So when you see these old homes in Miami and old walls, we still have some of the original walls that these Bahamian people showed white folks how to use to make their the structures in which they live. White people know how to get crops to grow in this soil, this rocky soil. Bahamians taught them how to plant and what to plant and when to plant it. So, and then of course Bahamian dishes became a part of our culture. So yes, you're quite right. Many things, both in terms of
Okay, I just want to make sure we still have you.
Bahamians. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And then your book talks about, what is it? The Junkanoo. That was something that was popular, from what I understand, in the Coconut Grove area. Can you kind of talk about that?
Well, the Bahamians brought with them this Junkanoo tradition, which really derived in Africa, where folks would dress up in all kinds of costumes and parade themselves. Back in slavery, in the Bahamas and in other places that had similar kinds of this would be they were like a spoof on the white people. So and an unusual expression of liberty is to come in and even into the plantation owner's house and dance around and show oneself off. So these traditions really emanated out of Africa and were adopted in the Bahamas and then were brought into Coconut Grove. And we used to have a Junkanoo every year. We used to have the Goombay Festival, another tradition that came in with the Bahamians that has now sort of faded out, unfortunately, in South Florida.
Right, right. So we got a little bit of backgrounds with Coconut Grove. Another city that's not too far that I want to talk about is also Lemon City. Lemon City is another area that we understand Bahamians migrated to, both Black and white. So I just kind of want to know what was it about these cities, Coconut Grove and Lemon City, that were bringing migrants over, or at least attracting them?
Well, let's be clear about Lemon City. Lemon City is now what it is north of Miami. Miami didn't exist when Lemon City was established right after the Civil War in the 1870s as a farming community. But most of the Black folks who moved to Lemon City were African Americans, not Bahamians, although some Bahamians came up to Lemon City as well. But we're talking now about African American migration into the first agricultural farming settlement in what's now Miami-Dade County, being Lemon City. It was a very successful farming community. There were 3 separate Black communities in Lemon City. They're now all done away with. As tourism moved in and the city of Miami boundary moved farther north, these folks were displaced to the west to what's now Liberty City. But Lemon City was a very successful community, which was really supported by Black farm workers primarily.
Okay, all right. So we've heard a lot about Black migration, or I don't want to say a lot. You talked a little bit about what it was pertaining to the Caribbean, specifically the Bahamas. And then, like you said, you also have African Americans that are populating these different areas. We talked about how with the Bahamians, you know, there were reasons for them to start coming to South Florida. With African Americans, they were also migrating from other areas outside of Florida. And we know that there were different reasons for that. One of them, your book talks about the Great Freeze.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yes, the Great Freeze. So what happened during the Great Freeze?
It was actually two freezes right behind each other. The last one in 1895. It wiped out the beginning citrus industry in Florida. It killed the trees to the ground. The first freeze did, and just as they replanted, the second freeze hit and wiped out the citrus industry in Central Florida, North Florida. It was so cold that fish froze in the Florida Bay. The railroads could not operate. Thousands of livestock lost to the freeze. So as a result of this event, many farmers moved south of the freeze line, meaning down into South Florida, where they could be safe from freezes like that. So then with that, you had the city of Miami, and then further South Miami, Homestead, Florida City, all those communities grew up as farming communities because these North Florida farmers and Central Florida farmers were moving south and they needed workers. So Miami itself began really as a farming community, although the tourist part was important as well. But particularly South Dade County grew as a result of the Great Freeze. And many African Americans moved into what became, that's a photograph of one morning. I think that's DeLand, Florida, my hometown. Look at all the fruit on the ground, all the oranges on the ground. That's why that industry had to move farther south. And in any event, it led to moving and white people moving to South Florida. My grandfather was in Florida
And
when
you
this
just made
happened. I'm sorry. I was just going to say
No,
when
I'm
this
sorry.
happened.
You were making mention of your family.
Yes. I was just saying when the Great Freeze happened, my father's dad was in Florida. He'd come down into Florida right after the Civil War, probably arriving in the 1880s. And he told my dad about this freeze. He said the orange trees in Central Florida were absolutely gorgeous before this happened. And they were never the same after the freeze. He said the trees were gnarled and bent and the fruit was not as sweet. But his personal memory of that event was passed on to my dad.
Right. And does your family have a migration story as well during this time?
Oh, yes. Yeah, my family was a migrant family. I was born in DeLand in 1940. I'm now 80 years old. Roosevelt was president when I was born. And yes, we were migrants at that time. My dad was a fruit picker, picked oranges. My mom was a maid. And when the oranges were gone, when the orange season was over, there was no work for my dad. So in 1949, he loaded us up in his old jalopy that he bought and took us to Long Island, New York to work for the summers. So we migrated for 3 years back and forth from Central Florida to New York to pick potatoes primarily. And that's how we survived for those 3 years before we moved to Miami when I was 11. We moved here in 1951.
So a lot of movement happening for different groups. A lot of that being, economic reasons, just trying to find, a better way, a better means for life. Right.
That image was that's the year or maybe the year before. I was about 10 or 11 years old when that was taken. When we moved here and that image was taken, I was I think a student at Liberty City Elementary School, because there were children in North Dade County when we moved here, not even elementary schools. So we were bused from Bunch Park, Opelika, down to Liberty City and back every day. 2 hours on the road in total, and past white schools. That's an image of my family when we were migrants on Long Island. I'm the boy on the left with my hand on my chest. That's my mom behind us. And that was a rough life. We worked every day except Sundays, picking potatoes or apples or beans or whatever was to be harvested. And that's how we managed to survive. On the trip up to New York in 1949, Black people couldn't use restaurants or cafes. There were no bathrooms. So on these trips, we just had to, my mom would pack up the food and take it with us so that we wouldn't be subject to the indignity of going to the back of a white restaurant to be served. So we took our food with us, and the bathroom was the side of the road. But I guess for us boys, my dad, it was okay, but my mom had to do that too. And I think back on those days, how dehumanizing those trips were because of segregation and the danger of just being on the road as a Black family. It's really very frightening to reflect back on that time.
Right. And we will talk more about that, just the whole segregation and Jim Crow. But I actually want to talk about what you call the Black pioneers of Miami in your book.
Okay. All right. Before you take that, that's my grandmother. That's my dad's mom, as a matter of fact. She lived in Bland in Volusia County. And a lot of the things that we know about our family history came from Cora Dunn. I'm sorry, I cut you off. You were asking a question.
No, it's okay. It's okay. No, because you were mentioning just that whole experience with segregation and how dehumanizing it was. And I can only imagine. And I was saying that we will definitely go into that, later into our program. And I just kind of wanted to talk about the individuals that you called in your book, the Black pioneers of Miami, because you do have a section that talks about the incorporation, and there were a few individuals, right? So if you can tell us about the pioneers and what made them pioneers of Miami.
Well, what made them pioneers was that they got here first. Let's talk about two of them, Dana Dorsey and Florence Gaskins. Dana Dorsey was a young Black man from Quitman, Georgia, who was a carpenter who arrived in what became Miami right before the railroad did, 1896, right before the city was founded. Built a raft and came down alone, got here and started working as a laborer, but buying little lots of land, little pieces of land in what became Colored Town, and building shotgun houses, little very simple structures for folks to live in. And he rented those to people who came in after him and became very wealthy. Dana Dorsey was Miami's first Black millionaire. He was not the only one, but he made his money in land and building homes and renting them to other Blacks who came in. Mr. Dorsey became, even though he only had a limited education himself, he was the superintendent of colored education. If you were a Black person wanting to teach in the schools in Miami and Dade County in the 1920s, 1930s, you went to Mr. Dorsey's house, he interviewed you, and if he thought that you were qualified to teach in the Black school, then he would agree to you being hired. Mr. Dorsey was the first Black man who was allowed to own a car in Miami. When cars came out, Black folks couldn't buy cars. Dorsey bought a brand new Cadillac every year and had a chauffeur drive him around every Sunday to collect his rent. Florence Gaskins, to talk about a woman who arrived around the same time, Mrs. Gaskins was a widow. She came here from Jacksonville, about the same time as when Dorsey came in. And what Florence Gaskins did was to provide work for a lot of Black women in early Overtown. Henry Flagler had built what was called the Royal Palm Hotel, a magnificent structure on Biscayne Bay. It was located like where the DuPont Plaza building used to be located, right on the bay, huge, magnificent building. And Mrs. Gaskins started a laundry business. She would go over to the hotel, collect the white people's laundry, bring it to Overtown, Colored Town, distribute it to several Black women. And then she would normally pick up the laundry on Saturdays and then would bring it back the following Friday and have the women iron and wash and iron these clothes. And that's how a lot of Black women were able to make money at a time when there was limited work for Black women. And Mrs. Gaskins became the first Black woman in Miami. She had a private school and a real estate agency. And many others came in. Dr. Bill Sawyer, who was one of the first physicians in Miami, built the Mary Elizabeth Hotel and had one of the most popular nightclubs in Colored Town in his hotel. His daughter went to serve in the Florida legislature. The Sawyers became very rich. They really did. Even today, the Sawyer family has a lot of money. They won't admit, but Bill Sawyer Dr. Sawyer's son told me that the family did very well.
Do we still have you, Dr. Dunn? So we'll just give them one more minute just to make sure. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, we did for a little bit.
Okay. Where did I leave off? I was talking about Bill Sawyer, Dr. Sawyer, and I mentioned his daughter, Gwendolyn Sawyer Perry, who had a very tragic death, but that's another story. And Bill Sawyer Jr. and his wife, Bernice Sawyer, spent a lot of time with me talking about the Sawyer family and how successful his dad and mom were in Colored Town. But Bill Sawyer told me that when integration came, it killed them. A lot of the Black people who were rich lost when Black people could go and stay in white hotels or could go to white restaurants. So they really actually resisted integration because they knew that integration would mean the end of Black businesses for them in that community. So yes, these were pioneers. They came in at a time when Miami was extremely segregated and survived. Many of them helped other Black people along. Others didn't, got rich and moved out.
Right. You talked a lot about Colored Town, and we know that, like you said, integration kind of made it so that, you know, some of these Black families that were accumulating wealth because Blacks were investing into Black businesses were kind of losing it. Even in the cover of your book, I found it to be very interesting, only because you have Muhammad Ali, you have Malcolm X. Can you tell us where they are here specifically? Because I feel like that speaks to what you were just talking about.
It does. That image was taken at the Hampton House in Brownsville. The Hampton House had a kind of unfortunate history because it was built like the Sir John Hotel, another popular spot with Black tourists that came in. These very nice facilities were built as integration was beginning. So they only had a shelf life of about 10 years. And then Black folks didn't have to go to the Mary Elizabeth or to the Sir John or to the Hampton House for that matter. But in the 1960s, the Hampton House was still a very popular place for the Black elite and others, but mainly for Black folks who could afford to go in there. And right before Cassius Clay's big fight with Sonny Liston, he trained on Miami Beach and spent a lot of his time in Overtown and in Liberty City. In fact, I met the woman, Eunice Liberty. Mrs. Liberty was the woman in whose home Muhammad Ali stayed when he was in Miami training. He couldn't stay at a hotel because he was too popular and people would just swamp the place if they knew that where he was. So this lady had him as a guest for weeks at a time in her home. She was an educator, a friend of Mary McLeod Bethune, as a matter of fact. And she protected him and fed him and took care of him when he was in Miami. So that image was taken when, on a very, very hot time for Cassius Clay, was when he converted to becoming Muhammad Ali.
You just want to give him a couple of minutes because I'm sorry, we lost you again for a little bit, but you were talking about that being a big night for Muhammad Ali.
Yes, that was the time he switched. He came out as a Muslim, shocked the world. That happened in Miami. You know, a lot of things happened at that Hampton House that folks don't know about. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his "I Have a Dream" speech at the Hampton House. They have that room preserved, set up just as it was when he was there. But as I said, it came online late in history for segregation. Therefore, it was severely hurt when integration became a reality.
Right, and so with integration, we know that it's a colored town. There were a lot of other things going on. A little bit later, you have this I-95 construction that also negatively affected Overtown. So if you could briefly tell us about that, that'll be great.
Well, let's go back a little bit and talk about what Overtown looked like before the expressway came in. Some of the, like Good Bread Ad, I think I gave you guys a photograph of some of the housing in Colored Town before they built the Liberty Square housing project and before the interstate came in. But basically, here's what happened. So many people came into Colored Town, into now known as Overtown, that housing was a crisis. The conditions under which people were living was dangerous. You had, a good example, very few of these houses that you're looking at had indoor toilets. So people shared, several houses of shacks shared the same outdoor toilet until the city finally said that had to stop. But yeah, so many people crowded into the space that it was dangerous. One of the leading causes of death for young Black children was fire. Some of these dilapidated buildings, let's just hold back on the expressway one for just a moment and talk a little bit more about what conditions were in Overtown before. And you have another one of the images of Overtown. The one that had the I think Good Bread Alley. Oh, that's a little, okay. Never mind. It's okay. We can talk about those too, but that's okay. We can stay with this for a moment. 1933. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, before he took office, he was in Miami, and he was taken to Colored Town to look at the housing conditions there. And he saw that scene and others like it, and he was taken there by Father John Comer, who was a Black Episcopal priest in Miami at the time, in Overtown at the time. And Roosevelt promised to do something about this when he got to Washington. And what he did was to build the Liberty Square housing project. And that allowed for the overcrowding in Overtown, Colored Town, to move north. And that housing project was opened in 1937, the second public housing project in the country. And so now you had folks being able to have some choices other than living in Colored Town, in Overtown. That's yet to, yes, that image gives you a good idea of how dangerous it was in Miami at that time. When one of these shacks caught on fire, many of them caught on fire. That's why so many Black kids died in Miami in buildings like that. So that's what Roosevelt saw, and that's what he sought to change by building the Liberty Square housing project in Liberty City. So in late 1950s, mid 1950s, there were plans to run the Interstate I-95 into downtown Miami. So we can go to that image now. This is an important part of our discussion today. When the state and the federal government and the county and the city, to some extent, had to decide how to bring I-95 into downtown Miami, they had two choices. One choice was to bring that interstate right down the old railroad track. The railroad was no longer really operating that much, and it would have not removed so many people because there was land on either side of the railroad track that could be used to build the interstate. The downtown business community didn't want that. The Chamber of Commerce did not want that interstate coming down that railroad track. They wanted it to come further west, down 7th Avenue, so that downtown could eventually extend to the west across railroad track into Colored Town. That was the only way in which downtown could expand. It had to be to the west into Colored Town. They couldn't go east, that was the ocean. They couldn't go north, that was Lemon City, and that was, that was already crowded. South was Coconut Grove. The business community wanted the interstate to give room for downtown to expand into Overtown, and that's exactly what happened. The process of putting that thing in displaced probably 30,000 Black people. Overtown went from 40,000 folks to down to about 12,000 people, and severely created problems in Liberty City. These folks had no place to live except these apartment buildings that were cheap, hot, dangerous in some respects, and there were very few options people had to resist being removed. So Black businesses were wiped out. It was just a shame. After this happened, people could no longer go back and forth from one side of Overtown to the other. Now had to go up to 20th Street, down to 14th Street, just to go across the other side of the interstate. So it was very, very disruptive, very regrettable that it happened, but it was planned. It was wanted by the Downtown Business Association to allow to happen what we see happening today with these buildings being built in Overtown that would not have been there otherwise.
So I guess to your point, it's sort of like deliberate devastation. Am I correct?
It was deliberate. And when you understand the people who owned the land that was taken by the expressway were not black people. They were white people. Many of them lived in New York. They were absentee landlords, lived on Miami Beach. You know, the few houses that Dana Dorsey built, Mr. Dorsey, weren't that many in terms of the total number of folks who got displaced and houses that were owned by white people. So I'm glad we stayed on this point for a moment. Black folks in Dayton, in Florida in general, are landless. We don't own land. That too is not an accident. We are a landless, we rent. The few of us who managed to buy land or accumulate land, God bless us, we did that, but very, very few of us were able to do that. Most of us ended up working for wages and renting from white people. And that is one reason why so many black folks were wiped out by the interstate, because to forgive them for having been displaced by the roadway.
Right, right. And to even bring further harm, you know, into what was going on, we know that policing wasn't something that was positive either when it came to
It was a problem.
Black areas,
Yeah.
Black colored town.
Yeah.
So we know that further, specifically, if you want to talk about a major event, late 70s, early 80s, we had the McDuffie riots that were going on. I guess one of the extreme cases of bad policing. Tell us a little bit about that particular event.
Well, there had been a number of events involving the police and blacks in 1979, leading up to the McDuffie killing in December of 1979. One of those events involved a white Florida highway patrolman who put a little black girl, she was about 8 years old, in the backseat of his car, stopped her as she was going home from school, told her she looked like somebody who stole some candy, put the child in the back seat of his car, drove out into the woods, and got into the back seat with this child and fondled her. And the child told aunt and uncle with whom she was living in South Dade. When she got home, the police came and they arrested this man for that. And long story short, he got off. And that was just one of the incidents that really had a lot of black people on edge. Another young black man named Randy Heath in Hialeah was shot by a police officer. He was actually urinating in a warehouse zone area. And the cop comes up, puts a gun to his head and says, "Don't move." And he moved and the gun went off and had a hair trigger on it. So these things have been happening up to the McDuffie killing itself. McDuffie was a young insurance man in his 30s, former Marine Corps corporal, no police record. He was an insurance salesman. And in December of 19, near Christmas time, he borrowed a black and white, black and yellow Kawasaki motorcycle from a friend and drove down to South Dade to visit someone. And that night, returning on Miami Avenue, driving north, he was speeding. I did a book on that ride, and so we did a lot of research on what happened that night. Anyway, he was speeding. At least a dozen police cars take out after him. He finally stops at Miami Avenue and Northeast 38th Street. Voluntarily stops. And he was set upon by at least 6 to 8 white police officers. No black officers were present. No female officers were present. And they began to beat him. They handcuffed him behind his back, had him on the ground, with his head against the curb. And one of the officers, a man named Alex Marrero, straddled McDuffie's and then comes down with a couldn't recall. And McDuffie starts to die. It took him another 2 or 3 days to actually die. And then these officers began covering up what had happened. They took their nightsticks and broke the glass on the gas tank of the motorcycle to make it look as if the motorcycle had fallen over. And McDuffie was injured in this accident. Of breaking the glass on both sides of the gas tank. So when the medical examiner, Dr. Ronald Wright, saw the bike, he wanted to know, well, if there was an accident, why why is the glass on both sides of the tank broken? And that began the investigation, led to the arrest and trial of 5 of these officers in Tampa. It was too hot a case for Miami. In Tampa took this case, and on May 17th, several weeks after having this case, the jury went out and came back with not guilty verdicts for all the officers who were involved. And that outraged Black. It was a Saturday, beautiful afternoon when this happened. I got a call from a reporter from UPI asking me if I knew, this was around 4 o'clock, that they were killing white people up on 62nd Street. I said, I didn't know that they were doing that, but I was still in shock from the verdicts, as I think all of Miami was, because we followed that trial from gavel to gavel. It was a very public trial. And everybody, white, Black, Hispanics that I talked to, expected these people to be found guilty. Anyway, I go up to 62nd Street and 12th Parkway, and I saw hundreds of people on the streets by then, hundreds of people. And I saw a group of maybe the street.
Do you still have you?
I'm sorry, we're broken up again.
Yes, but you can continue. Yes.
Okay. The first car that was driven by whites that comes into this riot zone was driven by a boy named Jeffrey Culp. His brother was in the car with him and a young girl in the back seat. Brick bottles. The Culp lost control. The car goes across the street and hits one of the buildings in the Living Square housing project. Crashes there. And there's an 11-year-old Black girl standing there. Her name is Shamrika Perry. And that crash cut her leg off. I didn't see this. I got there after this happened. But that's why these young Black men were killing this boy when I got there. They were using a Miami Herald dispenser to repeatedly crash it down on this boy's head. So I got out of my car. I saw one body laying in the median strip. I thought it was a bundle of clothing, but it was this boy had been injured. And the other boy was being killed by these people, with hundreds of folks standing around watching this on a Saturday afternoon, broad daylight, and it was amazing. Then I heard one of the guys that was doing that say, we're going to get the Uncle Tom niggas next. They were talking about me. And folks like Mrs. Range and others of us who were supposed to be delivering for Black people, they were angry at all of us. So I went up, got in my car, I drove down to a police substation, tried to get them to come up to Liberty City. But they wouldn't. It was midnight by the time they got an armored vehicle up to 2nd Street and 12th Parkway to get these boys out of there. The girl, Deborah Getman, she was 15 years old. She was in the back seat when this happened. She got out of the car, and some Black folks in one of those apartments in the Liberty Square housing project hid her until they could get her into a cab later that night, and they saved her life. And that was the beginning of the riot. It lasted 4 days. 18 people died, 8 white, 10 Black, $100 million worth of damage. And the community's never been the same. That was the riot.
Wow. So definitely a tragedy.
I'm sorry, you go ahead.
No, I was just saying that to further, I guess, give us a firsthand account, we actually have a retired officer, another special guest with us today that kind of wants to give us his experience. He was actually a young boy, maybe 12, 13 at the time. And so what we want to do is actually get a little bit of his insight, his experience being so young at that time. So what we will do, we're actually going to take a short break. And to our guests, we want to just show you a little bit about or some photos from Overtown while we break, and we will come back with our special guest. All right, welcome back, everyone. And with us today, I'd like to introduce another special guest. We have with us retired police officer LaRue Sarvis. LaRue has actually grown up in Overtown, and he's going to share with us a little bit of his experience with the McDuffie riots. We just spoke to Dr. Dunn about that. And so, LaRue, welcome. Thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm trying to adjust my, there we go.
All right, and so, yes. So before we get into your experience having lived through the McDuffie riots, can you just briefly share with us what it was like growing up in Overtown?
Well, my family migrated to Overtown from South Carolina in 1966. My mom was every bit of 16 years old and pregnant with me. And we moved to 219 Northwest 6th Street in Overtown in 1966. I was born in 1967 on that corner. And then we moved to 19th Street and 3rd Avenue, the town park. And then we moved back to 11th Street and 2nd Avenue where my dad sold fish on the corner for 40 years, right there at 11th Street and 2nd Avenue.
Okay. So, yeah, you definitely have lived a good chunk of your life. Your family has history there as well. What do you remember about the McDuffie riots?
I remember the smoke. I remember the people yelling and screaming. I just remember just chaos. But the funny thing is, my dad was still selling fish because we lived on 19th Street and he sold his fish on 11th Street and 2nd Avenue. So I had to walk with my little sister from 19th Street down to 11th Street. And I remember just people screaming, just smelling smoke. And the funny thing about it, I was never afraid because everybody knew who we were. Just walking down the street, getting to 11th Street, I was just amazed. And I was just, you know, I really didn't know what was going on, to be honest with you. That just happened. As a matter of fact, when the riots occurred, it occurred a day after my birthday. Some accounts have the riots starting on the 17th of May, the 18th of May. I was born on the 16th of May. And I remember the day before, I was celebrating my birthday. The next day, I'm walking through a war zone.
And how old were you, LaRue? Just want to make sure.
13. I was 13.
Okay. Had you gone through anything before, like living there, any disaster prior to that?
I didn't hear the question. You was breaking up.
So you having been growing up in Overtown at this time, you're 13 years old. Had you ever seen any sort of chaos like that before? Any sort of uproar, anything prior to that? No.
My life in Overtown was blissful. I never had any issues in Overtown. Matter of fact, it was probably the best time of my life. Even though I knew what was going on around me, you know, we still had the pimps, the pushers, the drug dealers, and all of this stuff. But that was like every day for me. I thought everybody in America was living like I was living. I didn't know I was poor. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I had to get to my dad to you know, sell that fish.
Right. And how would you say that whole tragedy changed Overtown?
Oh man.
How did it impact Overtown?
Of course, excuse me. Of course, it was more police presence in the area. You know, it pretty much just made everybody aware what was going on. But I think that my experience might be different from everybody else's experience because I was number one to get into trouble. I was always straight-laced. You know, I had lunch with a friend of mine who I haven't seen in like 30 years. He said that I was square. So, you know, I never had any interactions with law enforcement at all growing up. I never did. And for me, the only thing I was worried about was my little sister And, you know, the only thing that we was doing was just, you know, I helped my dad scale fish. I played basketball at Gibson Park. And, you know, I was young. I was a young boy. I didn't understand, you know, what was really going on because it never affected me. I think if I was maybe in my 20s at that time, it probably would have. But growing up, I was just seeing everything, the police cars streaming down the street, the people, you know, being arrested, and everything. But I was a little boy, so I guess, you know, I wasn't on their radar at that time.
Right. Okay. And so my final question for you, what are your thoughts on the current state of Overtown? And do you visit currently? Are you there at all?
Yeah, I am. It's gentrified. They have high-rise hotel. They have high-rise condos there now. I mean, Overtown is now downtown. It's nothing like how I grew up. And I was listening to Mr. Dunn. I just wish that we knew what was coming when it came. My dad owned the corner on 11th Street and 2nd Avenue. I found out later. And from what I understand, that corner just sold for millions of dollars. And we just didn't know. You know, we just did not know. Long story, a short story. I met a young lady all the way up here in Broward County that was telling me that she bought a condo in Overtown. And that's when I went down there and saw these buildings, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe it. Completely different from what I was growing up. I mean, we just didn't see it coming. We did not see it coming.
Okay, well, LaRue, thank you so much for giving us that little snapshot of what it was like. We thank you for your time. Hopefully you can join us on a future segment, but thank you again. All right, and so to our guest.
One more thing, when you talk to Mr. Dunn again, I remember him by giving an interview about Janet Reno when he asked for her to step down during the McDuffie riots. I remember that. And I want to thank him for, you know, helping us out and being there for us, because he's a very respected man, and I'm glad he's okay. The last time I saw him was during the 80s on TV, asking Janet Reno to step down. And it's good to see that he's doing fine. And I want to thank him for everything that he did for us, you know, during that time. Really appreciate it.
Yes, if he didn't hear you, I'll definitely relay the information.
Okay.
Thank you, LaRue. All right, and so now we are going to segue back to Dr. Dunn. Before we do that, we'd like to share with you a clip from one of his documentaries.
So what you see in the 1970s is that boatloads of Haitians, because of the political turmoil in Haiti and also the need for increased economic opportunities, start coming to Miami. They're assuming that they're going to be treated maybe the same way the Cubans are being treated. And so there's going to be more opportunity for them to stay here. That's not the case, of course. After they land here, and these are thousands and thousands of people, it kind of freaks the city of Miami out. They're dealing with also the influx of a huge amount of Cubans at the same time. So these policies developed, which are known as wet foot, dry foot.
All right, and so we are back with our guest, Dr. Dunn. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we just watched a clip from your documentary, Black Miami in the 20th Century. And this portion specifically talked about the migration of Haitians. You know, earlier we spent a lot of time talking about other Black groups, but here we want to focus on the Haitian migration. And in that clip, we hear there was some disparity. There was a little bit of there was some inequity there in terms of how Haitian refugees were treated in comparison to maybe some of the other refugees, like the Cubans. Can you kind of maybe speak on that a little bit more?
Yes, when the Haitians began arriving illegally in the 1970s, it was traumatic for Miami. They were black. They were basically without skills. They were refugees. They could not speak the language. It was a very overwhelming problem for Miami in a very short period of time. The Haitians were not welcome. They were not welcomed by the white people of Miami at the time. They were not welcomed by the Hispanics at that time, and they were not welcomed by the black people here. I heard more things said about Haitians that were bad, discriminatory, mean, by black people, by African Americans, putting down Haitians. So we were a part of the problems. African Americans were a part of the problems that newly arriving Haitians had. In the black community, the way you insulted another black person, another African American, was to call him a Haitian. You Haitian. I heard that in my own house. I'm an expert on race, and my son, who's now a lawyer, I won't go beyond that, called his brother, he may be 8 years old. You Haitian, you call you, but you, even in my own house. So these stereotypes, these attitudes about Haitians were ingrained in the community, that they were diseased, that they were taking our jobs. Edison High School, as a consultant, as a school psychologist, trying to help them when Haitian students started going into Edison, with African American students having been there first. The school had to close down twice because of fights between Haitian students and African American students. And there were Haitian parents at the time who didn't want their children to have anything to do with African Americans. I talked with Haitian mothers who said, no, my daughter cannot date an African American boy. They're loose on their morals, they're thugs, they not let her daughter bring this boy home. Same thing with African American parents. They got voodoo, they got disease. We had more problems with black coming. They would come into the black community, to housing in schools and facilities in the black community, in the African American community. And these conflicts were very severe. The only thing that stopped the conflict at Edison High School was so many Haitians eventually took over the student body ship that they were the dominant group, and so the fighting stopped. So yeah, I hate to revisit that. I would like to think that black people here welcomed the Haitians and helped them the way the Cubans did with newly arriving Cubans, but we didn't. And the community didn't, the wider community didn't. And once the whole thing about AIDS caught on in the mind of the body politic, that these folks would bring in this disease here and you couldn't have anything to do with Haitians because it was just terrible. Only the stamina of the Haitian people in Dade County, in Miami, has been the only reason I can explain their survival and their thriving here in Miami. Just their stamina and the refusal to be put down by anybody. I respect them very much for what they've accomplished. We have more business successes in Little Haiti than we do in Liberty City and Overtown.
Yes, and Dr. Dunn, I have to say, this isn't even just you studying this. Myself, I'm of Haitian descent, and what you're saying is absolutely true. To insult someone by just calling them a Haitian, that was a big thing. It was to the point where I had friends that wouldn't even identify as Haitian, even though they were, because it was just there was such stigma behind it. And you know this as well. There were even stories of Haitians committing suicide because of all of, what they were going through. And then furthermore, like your book describes, it wasn't even individuals that were targeting Haitians. You had, like you said, the CDC that was putting out this information about Haitians being carriers of AIDS. So that did a number on my people, and it really did. I'm going to put myself in that. Talking about the Black experience, it trained, and even to this day, probably still just have horrible memories. Yes.
Well, frankly, I don't see a whole lot of cooperation even today between the Haitian community and the African American community. We could be accomplishing a great deal more if we would, one, stop fighting each other in the political arena, but and recognize all those areas in which we could cooperate and become an attractive segment of this community for folks who could come in and spend money in our communities. So we need to do a lot more togetherness than we are doing. Not to be opposed to anybody else, but just because we have so much in common, our Blackness, if nothing else, we should be doing more to come together than I see happening.
So, Dr. Dunn, maybe this was something that I just read in your book, or maybe it was something that you just mentioned. We know that at least one of the reasons why for African Americans there was this pushback when the Haitians were arriving, there was this notion that the immigrants were probably taking some of the work. We also know that they were moving into the areas that they were living in. So there was, some they were upset about that.
Schools.
And I don't know if just all of that tension from history just continues to build. And that's why you said even until today, we have this issue. But my question to you is, what more do we need to do or maybe put behind us so that we can come together and unify?
Well, we need to put aside the stereotypes that we have of each other. For those Haitian parents who thought every Black American girl was loose and every Black American boy was a thug, we need to put that aside. For every Black American family who felt that every Haitian child was a voodoo believing, disease-carrying person, that we need to put our stereotypes about each other aside and recognize that we have more in common as Black people than we have that divides us. That's a conscious effort that needs to be heralded from the pulpits and on the radio waves and in the media that we both groups attend to. The message is not let's put aside those kinds of things and move beyond. I think we have been reinforcing some of the old stereotypes in recent days. The other thing that I feel will eventually help us with a lot of the tension and divisions within the Black community is intermarriage. As Haitian Americans marry Black Americans back and forth, a lot of these cultural things will meld together. That's inevitable. We live in the same geographic areas. We go to the same places, generally speaking, and eventually, certainly in schools, I think the cross-cultural marriage and what have you will do a lot towards easing tensions between these two groups in the future. I see that happening already.
Right, yeah. All right, and so Dr. Dunn, there's actually so much that we did not get the chance to talk about, but we also want to give our audience some time to be able to ask questions. And so we're going to open up the platform in order to do that. Who knows, maybe we can have you on again, because there's, again, so much that I didn't get to touch on and I really wanted to, but it happened. So
another time.
Yes. All right. And so the first question we have says, really interesting to learn about how these neighborhoods have changed over the last 100 years. It's also changed quite a bit in the last 10 years or so. What are your thoughts on these recent changes and gentrification of many of Miami's historically Black neighborhoods?
I think the changes in gentrification in these communities, Coconut Grove especially, Overtown, it's terrible because the past is disappearing. We showed earlier some of these beautiful Bahamian homes in Coconut Grove. Maybe a couple of dozen may remain today. If you stand out on 3rd Avenue or 2nd Avenue today in Overtown appears to be in a canyon. So many buildings moving in on that community. So what do I think about that? I think it's inevitable. I think it's unstoppable. There are folks in this community who purchased land in Overtown and Coconut Grove and Liberty City 50 years ago and just held it until today, until they could benefit from gentrification. So what could be done about it? There have been some efforts, I know, in Coconut Grove to declare some of these buildings historically important and worthy of preservation, but not nearly enough of that happens. I think probably in the next 10 years, you'll see more people who are Hispanic in Overtown than you'll see Black people on the streets of Overtown. What can be done about it? Not much. You can't tell people who to sell their properties to. I just hope that some of the historic structures will survive, and I hope that some of the members of these communities will survive. But South Florida is a very, very popular place. A lot of folks want to live here. And now they can't live anyplace else close to downtown except in Overtown. And that's the threat that that community faces.
Okay. All right. And so our next question, why is it important for you to write books about history?
We opened the program by me explaining stories of Black heroes and heroines, stories of Black resistance, stories of Black triumph are suppressed in our history books. They're just not there. I wrote the first book that I did on Black Miami history because as I went to libraries, I saw nothing that told the story in a comprehensive way. And I saw the same thing all County, Polk County, Duval County, and look for Black folks in the history books. You'll see Black people picking cotton, taking care of white people's babies, or sweeping the streets. So what I wanted to do, and I hope other scholars will also do, successfully moved our race forward. That's why I chose to write these books.
Yes. And as you and I were talking earlier, I was mentioning how you did such an excellent job in making sure to not limit the Black experience to just African Americans, because as we discussed, Black people consist of so many people from all over. And so I just want to make sure that I thank you for that. And we have another question. What can people do to help make sure these stories of Black Miami are preserved and shared?
What can be done?
Yes.
You know, I think the way that this history now has to be gotten out there is on the internet. I don't think museums or books, for that matter, will really reach the masses of people who really need to know these stories. So my view now is that we do need to have our museums and our centers that collect these stories and tell these stories, but we must find new ways to put these stories out there on the internet in the virtual world, where people can learn what happened in Miami history without ever going into a museum, because that's the reality that we face. We have to find new ways to teach history to the new generations. And that's not by expecting them to come into a museum and look at photographs on a wall. We've got to get more in Did we lose?
Okay, one minute. You're still there? Okay.
I'm here. What advice?
Okay. All right. All right. So another question. Okay. What advice do you have for younger generations who are trying to make positive changes in their communities?
Thank you for that question. Vote. Vote.
All right.
I mean, listen, it's not magic. If you didn't vote the last time around, then don't say anything to me. It's not that difficult. If you really want to make a difference, just vote, and then try to get other people to do it. That's the way great change happens. I guess the other thing is there's always somebody that could use some help from you. Just help somebody along. You know, particularly if you could be a mentor to someone. Just pick one kid in your church, in your kid's school, and that family. And you know that you're in a position to help them, to help guide these boys in particular, these young boys coming up. We need to be surrogate dads and surrogate moms, but particularly surrogate dads, those of us who are able to do it, young enough to do it, should get out there and help these moms raise some of these boys. That's where a lot of our dangers lie in terms of Black survival. Young Black men being raised by single moms under very extreme conditions with no help, or at least not enough help from Black men. So I guess this message is to young Black men listening. It's not enough to be a big brother who shows up once a month to take a kid to a ball game. Help a family, help a kid, and stay with that family and stay with that child for the duration.
Okay. All right. And I'm not sure if we have any more questions. That might have been the last one. Just give one more minute. In what ways have you seen Miami change over the years?
When my family moved to Miami, you would see more Seminole Indians downtown than Hispanic people. You never heard Spanish when I moved here. How has it changed? A whole new population has moved into Miami. Yes, we saw Bahamians, because Bahamians, you didn't see Haitians, you didn't see such a variety of human beings in this community. And that's been the major change that we've had, because that influx of new people has changed where we live, what we eat, how we are entertained, what games we go to. Our whole community has been changed by the influx of new residents. I think that's been more for the good than for the bad, but that's a major, major change. The other thing I would say that's changed over the years has been the way that we are governed. From individual cities back in the 1950s to metro government. That's been major. Only through metro did we get metropolitan government, where the cities had to yield some power to a larger metro government that would then have a police force that would be effective all over the county, that would have a transportation system that would serve the whole county. That's a major change from little community, small city administration to becoming a metropolitan center and a world-class center as we are today. And I guess the other thing I would mention in terms of change has been, I don't think that we are as beautiful as we used to be. I don't think, as a community, I don't think we are as pretty as we used to be.
Dr. Dunn, we still have you?
We had a break just for a moment. I was describing how I think the community is not as pretty as it was in earlier years, and I think I had an interruption at that point. So, do you have a question?
Did you mean physically beautiful, or just in terms of how maybe as a people we're not as beautiful? I just want to get an understanding of what you mean by that.
One of the ugliest things that we have is the expressways. Just look around. One of the ugliest things we have is this highway system that we now have. I think buildings, look at what they're putting up in Coconut Grove, these buildings are putting up. They're like pill boxes. They're little white little pill boxes. Nothing attractive about them. They take down these beautiful little Bahamian houses and they put these things up that somebody who's a millionaire could move into, and the community is no longer tree-lined, beautiful, folks with yards. On every possible yard, a foot of these properties that they're building in Coconut Grove, these homes they're building, where there used to be these beautiful Bahamian homes. So they're ugly. They look like fortresses in Coconut Grove. So the kind of architecture that I see emerging in South Florida is ugly, uninventive. Where are the great architects who could make us beautiful again?
Right. Okay. All right. So that was our very last question. And we want to just thank you, Dr. Dunn, for your time and for sharing with us. And we also want to thank LaRue Sarvis Jr., our special guest that we had with us. Thank you, LaRue. And we just want to our viewers, thank you for watching us. Thank you for supporting us. And if you have a story that you would like to share, you just make sure to follow us on our page at Beyond Vizcaya. You can actually go on our site, and there's a tab that's specific to Beyond Vizcaya as well. You'd be able to submit your stories pertaining to migration, labor, and cultural identity. So we just want to thank you, and hopefully you'll tune into our next one.